My name is Michael, and I'm 31 years old now, but what I'm about to share with you happened when I was 19 and completely changed everything I believed about life, death, and the organization I had been raised in since I was 7 years old. This is the story of how God Himself revealed the truth to me during a near-death experience that shattered every doctrine the Watchtower had taught me about consciousness, the soul, and what happens when we die. I was born and raised as one of Jehovah's Witnesses in a small town outside Denver, Colorado. Like many JW children, I was baptized young, at 14 years old, and my entire world revolved around meetings 3 times a week, field service every Saturday morning, and the constant pressure to be the perfect witness teenager. My childhood was structured around district conventions, circuit assemblies, and the endless cycle of studying Watchtower publications that claimed to contain the only path to salvation. But even as a teenager, questions were already eating away at me. Things I observed within the organization didn't align with what we preached about love, unity, and truth. I saw elders playing favorites, witnessed the cruel shunning of people who asked sincere questions, and felt the suffocating weight of rules that seemed more about control than genuine spirituality. The organization taught us that we were the happiest people on earth, but I looked around and saw depression, anxiety, and fear masked behind forced smiles and rehearsed answers. My father was an elder in our congregation, which meant our family was under constant scrutiny. Every aspect of our lives had to reflect perfectly on his position within the organization. I couldn't have normal friendships with kids at school, couldn't participate in sports or extracurricular activities, couldn't even celebrate my own birthday without being reminded that such celebrations were displeasing to Jehovah. By the time I turned 19, these doubts had grown into serious concerns that kept me awake at night. I was actively seeking answers to personal questions about practices I witnessed that seemed contradictory to what we claimed to believe. Why did elders hide serious sins while publicly reproving others for minor infractions? Why did the organization discourage higher education when they needed educated people to run their legal and financial departments? Why did our literature constantly change previous teachings but never acknowledge the contradictions? I had already received some disturbing answers through my own research and observation, but nothing prepared me for what God Himself would reveal to me through the most terrifying and transformative experience of my life. This experience would prove that everything the Watchtower taught about death, consciousness, and the nature of the human soul was not just wrong, but deliberately deceptive. It was March 15th, during my spring break from the community college I was attending against my father's wishes. He had wanted me to become a full-time pioneer instead of pursuing any form of higher education, but I had insisted that I needed some kind of skill to support myself. The tension in our house over this decision had been building for months. That weekend, my best friend Jake, who had also grown up in the organization but was starting to have his own doubts, invited me to go rock climbing at Garden of the Gods, about an hour south of where we lived. Jake's family were also witnesses, and we had bonded over our shared struggles with the restrictions and contradictions we saw in organizational life. I really didn't want to go that day. Something inside me felt reluctant, an unexplained heaviness in my spirit, but Jake seemed excited about getting away from the suffocating atmosphere of our respective homes where every conversation seemed to revolve around spiritual activities and organizational responsibilities. We drove to the climbing area early that morning, both of us eager to experience something that felt real and authentic, far removed from the artificial spirituality of Kingdom Hall meetings. The red sandstone formations rose dramatically against the clear Colorado sky, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace and connection to something greater than the organizational structure that had dominated my entire life. We started with some easier routes, both of us experienced climbers, who had been sneaking away to climb whenever we could manage it without our parents finding out. Rock climbing was one of the few activities that made me feel truly alive, where I could push myself physically and mentally without worrying about whether my actions would reflect poorly on my father's position as an elder. After successfully completing several moderate routes, Jake suggested we try something more challenging. There was a particular climb he had been wanting to attempt for months, a route that would test our skills and give us an incredible view of the entire park from the top. Against my better judgment, and despite feeling unusually anxious about the whole idea, I agreed to follow him up. We were about 60 feet up the rock face when disaster struck. I was leading the climb, carefully placing protection as I worked my way up a particularly technical section of the route. Jake was belaying me from below, managing the rope that was supposed to keep me safe if I fell. Everything had been going perfectly until I reached for a handhold that looked solid, but turned out to be a loose piece of rock. The moment I put my weight on that hold, it broke away from the wall completely. I watched in horror as the chunk of sandstone tumbled down toward Jake, while I simultaneously lost my balance and began to fall. The protection I had placed just a few feet below should have caught me safely, but in that split second of panic, something went wrong with the entire safety system. I fell freely for what felt like an eternity before my head struck a protruding ledge with devastating force. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. I felt my skull crack against the unforgiving stone with a sound that seemed to echo through dimensions. The physical pain was indescribable for just a moment, and then everything went black instantly as my consciousness was violently ripped from my broken body. But what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about life, death, and spiritual reality. The moment I lost consciousness in that physical realm, I felt my soul, my very essence, being pulled upward and outward into another dimension entirely. This was completely impossible according to Watchtower teaching. We were taught from childhood that humans don't have an immortal soul, that we are merely physical bodies animated by life force, and that when we die we simply cease to exist until resurrection day. Yet here I was, completely conscious and aware, more alert and alive than I had ever felt in my physical body, existing separately from my broken form lying motionless on the rocks below. I could think, feel, observe, and reason with perfect clarity. I was me, completely and fully me, but without the physical limitations I had always known. The Watchtower's teaching about soul sleep and unconsciousness in death was revealed as a complete lie in that moment of supernatural clarity. I could see Jake below, frantically calling for help on his cell phone, his voice echoing off the canyon walls as he tried to coordinate rescue efforts. But I was no longer connected to that scene in any physical way. I was being drawn upward into a realm of pure light and indescribable peace. A brilliant light began approaching me, brighter than the Colorado sun, but somehow not painful to look at, radiating warmth and love that penetrated every part of my spiritual being. This wasn't the harsh, demanding presence I had been taught to fear in Kingdom Hall meetings, but pure love and acceptance that drew me toward itself like a magnet. In that moment, as this incredible light surrounded me, my consciousness sent me what felt like a final message: you are dead. The terror that washed over me was indescribable. I was 19 years old with so many dreams and plans unfulfilled, and I was not ready to accept that my life was over. But even in that terror, I was amazed to find that I could still think, still feel, still exist as myself. Everything the organization had taught me about death being like deep sleep was proving false in real time. I found myself in what I can only describe as the direct presence of God Himself, and immediately I began asking questions. Not the polite, reverent questions we're taught to ask in prayer meetings with our heads bowed and eyes closed, but desperate, urgent questions from someone who needed answers right now. These weren't the rehearsed prayers from our kingdom ministry or the formatted requests we made at meetings, but raw, honest communication with the Creator of the universe. Where did I go wrong in my life? What did I do to deserve this? How could this be happening when I tried so hard to follow the organization's teachings and live according to their interpretation of Bible principles. I had been a faithful witness, attending every meeting, participating in field service, studying all the publications, avoiding worldly associations. So why was my life ending so abruptly? God simply looked at me with infinite compassion as I poured out question after question, never interrupting, never showing impatience with my desperate need to understand. His presence was nothing like the stern, judgmental deity portrayed in Watchtower literature, but rather pure love and understanding that made me feel completely safe even in this impossible situation. Then, in that divine presence, something clicked in my mind about the religion I had been raised in. The doubt that had been growing for months suddenly crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. All the contradictions I had observed, all the questions I had been told not to ask, all the fear-based control mechanisms I had witnessed, suddenly made sense in the light of this authentic spiritual experience. I looked up into that loving presence and asked the question that would change everything. Could it be that the way I was raised, could it be that this religion isn't the truth? Could it be that the Watchtower organization isn't really God's channel of communication? Could it be that everything I was taught about you, about death, about the soul, about how to have a relationship with you, could it all be wrong? The moment I voiced those questions, everything I had been taught about spiritual authority, about the organization being God's exclusive channel, about the Watchtower being the only source of truth, began to crumble around me like a house of cards. In that sacred space, far from kingdom halls and Watchtower literature, I was receiving direct communication with the Creator himself, proving that no organization was needed as an intermediary. The God I was encountering bore no resemblance to the harsh, rules-obsessed deity presented in our publications. This was a God of infinite love and patience, who cared more about my heart than my meeting attendance, more about my sincere questions than my blind obedience to human authority. This was a God who welcomed my doubts and questions rather than condemning them as signs of spiritual weakness. With tears streaming down my spiritual face, I cried out to God with everything in me, "Give me a chance to return and do everything differently. If I go back to life, will you answer me? Will you show me the real truth? Will you help me find authentic relationship with you that isn't filtered through human organizations and their interpretations?" I had already received other disturbing answers to my questions about the organization through research and observation, but this was the ultimate test. If God was real, if he truly cared about truth more than organizational loyalty, if he was really the loving Father I was encountering rather than the demanding taskmaster portrayed in Watchtower literature, then he would respond to my desperate plea. The love and compassion that flowed from his presence in response to my request was overwhelming. Without words, I understood that my prayer had been heard and accepted. I was being given the second chance I had asked for, but I also understood that my life would never be the same. I would return with knowledge that would separate me from everything I had previously known and believed. The next thing I knew, I was opening my eyes to see the faces of paramedics working frantically over my body. The transition was jarring and disorienting, like being suddenly jerked back into a world that felt heavy and restrictive after experiencing the freedom of that spiritual realm. When I tried to speak, my voice came out as barely a whisper, but I was alive, miraculously and inexplicably alive. The paramedics were amazed that I was conscious and responsive. One of them told me later that when they first arrived, they thought they were looking at a fatality. The amount of blood loss and the obvious trauma to my skull made survival seem impossible, yet here I was, not only alive, but apparently thinking clearly. During the helicopter ride to Denver Health Medical Center, I kept drifting in and out of consciousness, but each time I was aware, I felt that same supernatural presence that had met me in that other realm. I knew with absolute certainty that I was being sustained by divine intervention, that my survival was not a medical miracle but a spiritual one. At the hospital, I spent 3 days in intensive care while doctors ran test after test, trying to understand how someone with such severe head trauma could be neurologically intact. The neurosurgeon told my parents that based on the CT scans, I should have been either dead or in a vegetative state, yet I was sitting up in bed, having normal conversations, and showing no signs of brain damage. During those 3 days, my father visited me several times, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. On one hand, he was grateful that his son was alive, but on the other hand, he was struggling with what he saw as my reckless behavior in going rock climbing. He reminded me repeatedly that this accident was probably Jehovah's way of warning me about pursuing worldly activities, instead of focusing on spiritual goals. But something else happened during my hospital stay that confirmed everything about my supernatural encounter, and revealed another truth about the organization I had served faithfully for 12 years. While Jake visited me every day, and several of my school friends came to check on me, not a single elder from our congregation came to see me. My father was there because he was my dad, but none of the other spiritual shepherds, who supposedly cared for the flock, bothered to visit a young man who had nearly died. This glaring absence spoke louder than any sermon about the true nature of the conditional love they preached but failed to live. Where was the visiting of the sick that Jesus commanded? Where was the genuine concern for a young member of their spiritual family who was fighting for his life? Their absence revealed that their love was dependent on organizational compliance rather than genuine Christian compassion. When I was finally released from the hospital a week later, something miraculous had occurred that the doctors couldn't explain. All of my cognitive functions were completely normal, my motor skills were unimpaired, and even the severe depression in my skull had somehow improved significantly. The neurologist kept shaking his head and telling my parents that he had never seen anything like it in 30 years of practice. But I knew exactly what had happened. The God I had met in that other realm, the God of infinite love and healing power, had restored me completely so that I could fulfill the purpose he had given me. I was alive for a reason, and that reason was to share the truth about what really happens when we die and what authentic relationship with God actually looks like. The experience had revealed multiple truths that the Watchtower desperately tries to hide from its members: that we do have immortal souls that survive bodily death, that God communicates directly with his children without organizational intermediaries, that supernatural healing is real and available to all who ask in faith, and that the conditional love they preach is often completely absent when it matters most. Within 6 months of my accident, I had made the decision to leave the organization entirely. My father was devastated, threatening to kick me out of the house if I continued down this path of apostasy. My mother cried constantly, convinced that Satan had used my head injury to turn me away from the truth. Old friends in the congregation began avoiding me, and eventually I was disfellowshipped for asking too many questions and refusing to accept the elders' authority over my spiritual life. But I had received the greatest proof possible that everything we had been taught about death, consciousness, and spiritual reality was not just mistaken, but deliberately false. I had experienced my soul existing separately from my body, proving that humans do indeed have an immortal soul that survives physical death. I had communicated directly with God without the mediation of any organization, proving that the Watchtower's claim to be his exclusive channel was a lie designed to maintain control. Most importantly, I had been healed supernaturally in a way that the doctors couldn't explain, demonstrating that God still performs miracles today for those who seek him with sincere hearts rather than through organizational rituals and procedures. Looking back on my childhood in the organization, I now understood why I had always felt so restricted and unhappy despite trying desperately to be the perfect witness son. From age 7, when my family first started attending meetings, I had been a curious child forced to suppress my natural questions about the world around me. Before the organization entered our lives, I had been a normal kid who played sports, celebrated holidays, and had friends from all different backgrounds. But once we became witnesses, all of that changed. I was pulled out of school activities, forbidden from having close friendships with non-witness kids, and constantly reminded that my behavior reflected on my father's position in the congregation. The organization had stolen my childhood and adolescence with their fear-based control system, but God had given me back my life and my future. The experience taught me that I wanted to help other people escape the same spiritual bondage I had experienced, particularly young people who were questioning but afraid to leave because of family pressure. My near-death experience had revealed the truth that the God I met bears no resemblance whatsoever to the harsh, demanding deity presented in Watchtower literature, who supposedly requires absolute obedience to human leaders and their ever-changing interpretations of Scripture. The real God is accessible to anyone who seeks Him sincerely, compassionate toward our questions and doubts, and more interested in the condition of your heart than your meeting attendance or field service hours. He revealed this life-changing truth to me in the most dramatic way possible, through a supernatural experience that proved beyond any doubt that everything the organization teaches about death and the afterlife is designed to keep people in bondage to human authority rather than free to pursue authentic relationship with their Creator. Now I share this truth with anyone who will listen, praying that it will set them free just as it set me free from the fear and control that had dominated my life for 12 long years. The organization was not, and never had been, a place of genuine peace, despite their constant claims to be the most loving people on earth. It was quite the opposite, a place of fear, control, and conditional acceptance that drove away anyone who dared to think independently or ask sincere questions about their teachings. This is why I share my story today, despite the complete loss of my family relationships and the accusations of apostasy that I knew would follow. For every Jehovah's Witness who has secret doubts they're afraid to voice, for every person who has been told that questioning the organization is equivalent to questioning God Himself, for everyone who has felt the emptiness behind the facade of unity and love, I want you to know that real truth and authentic relationship with God exists beyond the walls of kingdom halls and the pages of Watchtower publications.